When I first started photography, I used to operate under the idea that the highest form of artistic conviction was to erase oneself completely. That the better I got at taking myself out of the equation, the better the work would be. The more serious, the more credible I would become as a photographer. I treated the act of invisibility not as a stylistic choice, but more so of like a moral virtue. The less I revealed about my intentions, the more noble the enterprise seemed. The mythology of the invisible photographer runs very deep in our medium. We speak very reverently about capturing the moment, as if a camera is just going around floating around invisibly throughout the world. And we romanticize the idea that the work speaks for itself, as if the photograph didn't need the photographer's eye. And as a young, impressionable photographer that wanted to make this his life's work, I latched on to that very quickly. It kind of felt like discipline, and it felt like rigor, and it felt these are the things that I needed to do in order to be taken seriously as a photographer. But most importantly, it protected me from the idea that my work looked like me. But as I've come to figure out now doing this over 10 years, that if you looked back on my work in chronological order, you could see or tell a lot about who I've been as a person throughout my career as a photographer. The sort of self-flattering fiction that I had about myself and the things that I clung on to. And today's lesson is about learning to distinguish those two things. Hi, my name is Jared Thomas Tapey. I'm a social documentary photographer and educator here in New York City, and you're watching my YouTube channel. Across my social media platforms, I've created 6 different segments, each of which pertain to certain aspects of photography. Crafting a photograph, life through the lens, marks of the maker, the creative connection, tools of the trade, and field notes. In today's lesson, we're going to be taking from my segment, Marks of the Maker, which is all about my own personal practices, philosophies, and moments that have shaped my creative identity so you can learn from my mistakes, so you don't have to make the same ones that I did. There's a big difference between knowing yourself versus centering yourself in your artwork. Between understanding that your perspective is undoubtedly embedded in who you are and the work that you produce, and the drastically different act of making your work about you, even when the work wasn't supposed to be about you. I think that as I've grown older, and again, been doing this for a while now, I've come to realize that there's an arrogance in pretending that your artwork has nothing to do with you. But there's an equally corrosive arrogance in pretending that your artwork is about you. It's that precarious territory between those two where most genuine creative work is created. If you're serious about your craft, then you have to learn how to balance both. The question is not whether you're there, because you are. The question is if it's by conscious or by accident. So our first point is knowing yourself without worshiping yourself. There's a very thin, humiliating line between confidence and delusion. Now, the overwhelming majority of new artists stumble into this just sort of naturally. There's a very particular time period in which you decide that you're going to start taking yourself seriously, and this sort of feels revolutionary. And that's because you discover an aesthetic sensibility. You start to develop what you think photography should be. This time period comes typically well before we have the 1, life experience, and 2, artistic experience to really be able to comment on things like this. But this phase is very necessary, and that's because it provides the creative scaffolding that the rest of our career is going to stand on. Let me warn you, it's emphatically not the destination. And that's because there is a difference between artistic cockiness and artistic assertiveness. Cockiness announces that this is my style. Receive it or reject it. But assertiveness says something a little bit more complicated and a little bit more honest. As you gain experience, you start to understand that this is how I see the world in this current moment. But I remain willing, and even more so obliged, to subject that vision to a rigorous examination. The first is very brittle because it has no mechanism for growth. It really can only harden or completely shatter. But the second is durable because it's grounded in self-knowledge and preservation that you are growing and evolving as time goes on. Knowing yourself as an artist is not a performance of self-importance. It's a recognition that your aesthetics, biases, morals, ethics, psychology, culture, your emotions are all actively shaping your creative identity and therefore dictating the choices that you make as an artist. We're not photographing the world, so to speak. We're more so photographing our negotiation and our experiences within it. What draws your attention? What makes you hesitant? What do you romanticize and what do you kind of instinctively avoid? Now, you may think that you are, objectively recording the world, but what you're actually documenting is the version of reality that you can emotionally withstand, the version that resonates with your sort of interior character. So when you begin to examine your work and who you are as a person with a sort of genuine curiosity, you begin to be able to render your sort of own psychology in a visual format. Are you drawn to isolation because you've spent a significant amount of your time alone? Do you gravitate towards tension or combat? These are questions that separate unconscious repetition from conscious artistic decision making. What a lot of new photographers get confused on is the equation between having a strong artistic opinion and possessing a strong artistic identity, meaning that they mistake aesthetic rigidity for depth. You can see this in the way that they defend stylistic choices as if they were under exterminating threat. Beneath that early onset sort of new coming artistic arrogance, there's almost always a fragile, unexamined insecurity of themselves and the work, often feeling like if I release my grip on this, I'll have nothing left to hold on to. But here's the paradox that requires a lot of careful self-examination. You have to simultaneously acknowledge that with your own life experiences, your history, your conscience, your way of moving through the world, the work would not and could not exist. But you have to resist the urge to make the work feel as if it were a monument. The importance of your consciousness. Now, self-knowledge is not ego when it's used as a navigational device. And that's because when you understand your habitual tendencies, you learn the ability to either lean into them or completely dissolve them. For example, you can understand that I know that I lean towards a little bit more of a melancholy scene, so I'm going to pursue more things like that. Or you can say the opposite. I know that I'm drawn to more melancholy scenes, so I want to start photographing things with a little bit more going on in the frame. That shift between unconscious repetition to conscious is where authentic growth usually begins to occur. Without you, there is no work. But without awareness, there is only the comfortable illusion masquerading what actual evolution looks like. Which brings me to my next point, which is learning when to shut up. I've run into this type of photographer more times than I can possibly count, and I'm sure you have too. And you may have, in any point in your development, been this photographer as well. And that is the type of photographer that claims with a wholehearted objectivity that they are documenting the world, and yet every single caption they write is about themselves and the process of them being in that moment. For example, I've seen photojournalists that are photographing tent scenes in protests make the entire thing about their own bravery. A portrait becomes evidence of their sensitivity. The neighborhoods that they go into become sort of like an aesthetic laboratory. It's just also exhausting to look at, especially if you've been in this for a long time. You can see it a mile away. And that's because there's a very specific kind of artist in general, maybe not just photographer, but artists in general, that can't help but insert themselves into every single thing that they do. They'll spend a week, maybe tops, embedded into a community that they didn't grow up in, don't have any generational ties with them, and will likely leave their documentation speaking as if they are now a professional on the topic at hand. They'll produce a series on struggle or resilience or a marginalized experience. And somehow the dominant tie between all of the imagery is not actually the thing that they're embedded in, but the profound difficulty and sensitivity that is required to make this work. And the subtext of what this work looks like and what it means is never subtle. It simply says, look at me. Look at how deeply I see. Look at how serious I am about this. And sometimes the work is not technically deficient. Sometimes it is successful imagery. But it's hollow because you can feel the artist's desire for attention. You can feel the desire to be perceived as important. And the fundamental problem with this type of thinking about your work is that it forecloses growth. When you center yourself in every project, when the implicit subject of the body of work is your own creativity, your own sensibility, your own sensitivity, intelligence, moral understanding, you stop listening and you stop being capable of an authentic surprise. The world ceases to become a place of inexhaustible complexity and instead becomes raw material for your ongoing project of your own personal brand. Meaning that you're no longer photographing to understand something. You're photographing to confirm what you already believe about yourself. Now, there's nothing wrong with making autobiographical work. If you're constructing a body of work that's explicitly about yourself, your own history, your own culture, your own contradictions, all of these things, then of course, center yourself. Be ruthless about it. Do the deep work and dive in. That is very legitimate creative territory. Art made for the artist's own sake can be as indulgent and self-referential as much as you possibly want. That type of work owes nobody restraint. But if you intend to work out in public spaces like I do as a street photographer, documentary photographer, in contexts where the audience has no personal investment, then different principles come into play. Public work is fundamentally a negotiation between your own internal life and the exterior reality of what you're representing. It's not exclusively about your own experience. And so that carries with it a lot of questions and moral implications, contexts, responsibility, the ethical dilemmas that the people within your frame are not just props. If you find yourself perpetually defensive about your intentions, if every critical response that you get to your work feels like a personal attack, there's a strong probability that you've centered yourself far too much. So, loosen it. When you center yourself as the dominant force in your piece of work, any legitimate critique feels indistinguishable from an attack on you personally. The capacity to extract yourself from the center of importance, specifically in projects that don't center you, is not self-erasure. It's a form of, life maturity, but creative maturity. You should be able to know that without a shred of a doubt that your own experiences and personhood is what made the work come to life in the first place. And still, decline to make yourself the hero of your work. You can possess very strong convictions about what you're photographing and still refuse to smother the subjects underneath that conviction. The less desperately you try to require the work to affirm your character, your importance, the more undeniable the mark you actually leave behind becomes. Which is exactly why I'm going to teach you about the line that nobody else teaches you how to walk. I believe that if a photographer stays committed to the work long enough and approaches it with a sufficient amount of honesty, then that is when real growth occurs. Now, the tricky part is that this growth is not something that necessarily looks tangible. It's not very obvious sometimes. It's not like the technical refinement or the metrics on social media going up type thing, but rather it's an internal recalibration that's very difficult to articulate. So I'm going to try my best to do so now. This type of growth happens at the moment in which you recognize with comprehension instead of intellectual understanding, actual comprehension, that the question has never been whether you were present in your work or not, but rather it's always been how were you present, and whether that presence serves or undermines the subjects within the frame. And most photographers never quite get there. They either double down on ego, which just makes their presence louder and a lot harder to ignore, or they overreact and disappear completely, producing work that is so neutralized that it's hard to even feel as if there was a human connection in the first place. Which is why that knowing yourself and centering yourself as an artist, occupy a very weird, paradoxical space. Now, from the outside, they can appear indistinguishable. Both involve strong perspectives. Both involve conviction. Both can manifest as a clear and deliberate voice. But internally, they're constructed on two very different fundamental foundations. And they're oriented in two entirely different ways. So when you step forward into a frame deliberately, when you explicitly declare that this work is about you, your history, your body, your memory, your very specific world experiences, you perform an act of clarification. You give the audience context, owning your position rather than obscuring it behind a veneer of false objectivity. In autobiographical work, in trauma-centered projects, or in identity-based examinations, stepping consciously forward is not an act of indulgence as much as an act of intellectual honesty. It sort of prevents the deceptive universalization of a fundamental experience that's unique to you, that's then translated to the masses. And so the advantage of this is control and accountability. You're not pretending to possess the neutrality you don't have. And so if need be, you can defend your choices in your work with a certain level of coherence because you understand its origins. But the disadvantage is that once you become comfortable with becoming the main center point of your work, it's hard not to do that anymore. Being the protagonist of your own creative mythology is very structurally satisfying. And that's because it provides cohesion and almost more so like a reputable brand. And once the work becomes about you, every project becomes, to some degree, another chapter in the ongoing story. But on the other side of the axis, knowing yourself without centering yourself cultivates an entirely different form of artistic strength. You develop comprehension of your tendencies and your biases, your emotional reflexes, but you deploy that comprehension as information rather than the headline. You use your own self-knowledge to sharpen your perception of the world around you, not to make the world a reflection of your own life. The benefit here is depth and dimensionality, meaning that your work becomes less predictable, more capacious, more responsive to the complexity of the world around you. And so the subjects in the frame are allowed to exist in their entire complexity, rather than being bent towards your own internal narrative. However, step too far in this direction, and a different kind of failure starts to emerge, and that's being timid. An excess of self-effacement produces blandness. If you neutralize your perspective so aggressively that no discernible evidence of yourself is found within the frame, the work can become cautious and almost non-committal, seeming afraid to take a stake. And I think it's within these two moments right here that a lot of people don't discuss adequately enough, because there's a very fine line. Stepping forward without self-awareness becomes ego. Stepping back without conviction becomes invisibility. And the problem is that you don't achieve equilibrium once and then it stays with you forever. You have to keep asking yourself with every project, every frame, why you're pressing the shutter. And the only way to consistently know why is to interrogate yourself in your own motives with a sort of brutal honesty. Am I photographing this because it actually serves what's happening here, or because it flatters my sense of self? Is this moment about the subject or how I want to be perceived for photographing this subject? If my name were stripped entirely of the credits, would this photograph still carry weight? And so the actual growth that separates photographers that make interesting work and photographers that merely make consistent work is the ability to hold both of those truths in constant tension. Without you, the work doesn't exist. And the work is not fundamentally about you. These things shouldn't resolve. And if you find that you're feeling resolved in these, there's a good chance that you've leaned too far to one side. Maturity as an artist is not the selection of a permanent position. It's the development and capacity to pivot, to step forward when your presence illuminates the frame, and to step back when your presence would only obscure it. Now, when I was working on my first book in Savannah, Georgia, I was thoroughly convinced that I was engaging in an act of documentary observation. I told myself that I was studying the city's history, its architectural morphology, and the sort of generational weight that was embedded in a lot of these communities. I approached the subject with what I thought was a sort of disciplined objectivity. I did all of the things that I would suggest to any new documentary photographer or photojournalist do, which is study extensively about the things that you are going to be framing. I walked the city for a countless amount of hours. And I do still believe that I worked to honor the types of communities that I was going into, without imposing my own sort of narrative on what I thought about it. But what I realized was that when I finally laid out all the images for sequencing, I sort of saw something that I hadn't really anticipated. And that was a pattern that had started to emerge, not from the city itself, but was definitely coming from within me. Certain quiet porches, certain empty intersections, the way that late afternoon light had been pressing itself against peeling paint. And I had to come to grips with the fact that I had been projecting something onto the architecture of the city. Now, I don't know if this is specifically because I myself found something in the city of Savannah and the architecture and the communities that I was within that resonated with me deeply, because I wasn't going out to make images to expose myself. It's more something that I found after the fact. But regardless, that awareness had allowed me to do something that helped me understand what I was actually photographing. When I began my ongoing project here in New York 5 years ago, that same sort of dynamic reasserted itself with a very great intensity. Of course, New York is louder, faster, more complex than the city of Savannah. But it almost allowed me to be able to understand my own emotional complexities at a much faster pace. I could photograph isolated persons standing on a train station waiting for the train to arrive and feel almost physically the sense of isolation that they were feeling in that moment. I could read the tension that somebody carries in the way that they hold their shoulders back. But herein lies the problem, and it's because it's dangerously easy to mistake empathy for accuracy. And it's even more so dangerously easy to mistake recognition with understanding. And so over time, through, a lot of self-honesty and diving into who I am and the work that I want to produce and the work that I have produced, I began to create a more precise understanding of what was actually happening in those moments. And what I was perceiving was not purely the subject, but rather the subject and myself experiencing the world at the same time. And this is where things begin to get a little bit more complicated. And that's because photography without a self-sufficient awareness can function as a very strong and pure psychological defense. The act of raising a camera creates a sort of barrier between your own internal instincts and who you are as a person and the world around you. It permits observation instead of absorption. Now, in certain circumstances, right, that distance is appropriate and professionally understandable. But in others, it functions as a shield. It allows the photographer to be close in proximity to something emotionally significant while remaining insulated to what's actually stirring within them. And so when I review my own work now, I never begin with the technical proficiencies of a frame. I look first for emotional repetition. Where did I press towards drama because it aligned with my own internal feelings? Where did I refuse to photograph joy because I wasn't feeling very joyous that day? Where did I confuse physical proximity with comprehension of my subject's experience? And these questions are very important to ask because your photographs are not separate entities or separate identities that exist independently of you. They are a direct extension of your attention. And as we all know, attention is selective and partial. It's deeply conditioned by the interior life of the person making the frame. The growth that happens is in developing the perceptual precision to recognize that in any given moment, when you're projecting and when you're perceiving, when the camera is helping you identify something in a clearer way, or when it's helping you avoid that feeling altogether. Which brings me to my next point, coffee break. And that is the lie that we are not our artwork. I have a very hard time separating artist from art. And this phrase is passed around through every single medium reflexively. Call me woke, call me whatever you like. I think that the term that we are not our artwork, or we should be able to separate artist from art, is a fucking stupid excuse and a shield that people within every medium of artwork have created to separate the shitty behavior of artists, and I just don't agree with it. I think that art is made by people, and we are not able to separate the identities of both of those things just because we like something. And if an artist that we like does something awful, I cannot separate that art from what they have done. But to be fair, when deployed judiciously, that separation does serve as a legitimate psychological function. Meaning that if every single photograph that we take operated as some sort of comprehensive referendum on your value as a human being, you would abandon the work before you ever had to face any sort of consequence. A certain degree of emotional distance from the immediate outcome is not a weakness. That is a prerequisite for a sustainable creative production. But as a creative philosophy, taken to its logical conclusion, that phrase becomes something much more troubling, which is just a convenient method to avoid accountability that serious work demands. Now, if you approach photography casually, you don't want to necessarily do this as a full-time career. You don't want to be a living artist. You just do it for the fun of it because you like taking pictures. Then this analysis is not for you. You can skip this part if you'd like. Make whatever you want. Feel your impulses. Do whatever. You don't have to feel the need to interrogate every frame. And it's true that not every single photograph requires a deep dive psychological investigation. But if you describe yourself as serious about the work, if you speak with a sort of investment in the craft, voice, legacy, building something that endures, then you don't have the intellectual luxury of insisting that your art exists completely independent of who you are as an artist. Every time you raise a camera, you're making decisions that are far more revealing than they are technical. You're deciding what deserves to get preserved and what doesn't. Those decisions are not neutral, and they're created with an extraordinary specificity to your upbringing, your fears, your cultural conditioning, your desires, your unexamined prejudices, and this sort of constellation of both unresolved and resolved psychological material that you carry with you into every single situation that you raise a camera. To insist that these patterns are unrelated is to almost willfully deny yourself the most valuable diagnostic tool available to you as an artist. And growth requires a very honest diagnosis. It requires an uncomfortable truth that the work that you create is a direct reflection of how you move through the world. So therefore, if your photographs feel flat, it may be because you're protecting yourself from something. If they're repetitive, you may be circling around something psychologically that you just can't get rid of. If they feel empathetically limited, it may be because you're not being attentive enough with enough sufficient depth or patience to understand the subjects in your frame. These deficiencies are not corrected by gaining better equipment. These corrections are made by deepening your own self-awareness. So how do we use that self-awareness to deepen our own work? Well, there's a truth behind the fact that a lot of photographers expend an enormous amount of creative energy working around things rather than confronting them. It's my belief that the most direct and reliable path to becoming a better photographer is to become a more developed, more honest, and more self-aware human being first. That doesn't mean being a more successful person, whether it be financially or monetarily. Those are the same things. Metrics-wise on social media, those aren't the things that I'm talking about. I mean more honest in what you're doing when you raise the camera, and becoming less defensive about what your photographs say about you and what they reveal in your interior life. I know that I do this all the time. I discuss the cultivation of vision, the refinement of a style. So many of us analyze compositional grammar, things like lighting and timing and subject matter, things like that. But very few of us discuss what I call the ethical dimensions of self-development, which is the recognition that character, in the deepest sense of the word, functions as the philosophical or psychological lens behind the physical lens. That who you are, how you inhabit a space, how honestly you are with your own world experiences, how rigorously you examine your own motives, ultimately determines what kind of photographs you're capable of making. Socrates has encoded this in one of the most simplistic forms, which is know thyself. And then Carl Jung extended this into a psychological territory, arguing that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and then you'll call that fate. Now, if we substitute life for creative practice, the observation holds the same sort of equilibrium. Until you make your habitual choices, your reflexive aesthetic choices, your unconscious emotional preferences conscious and available for examination, then they'll direct your photographs, and we'll call that instinct. And the truth is that a lot of photographers operate on an unexamined instinct. Having the ability to dive deep into what makes you tick and have that self-awareness becomes a sort of leverage that you can use when out in the field. It allows you to stretch your capabilities in a more targeted and precise way. The psychologist Abraham Maslow said that what one can be, one must be. And in that, he's discussing the concept of self-actualization, which is an ethical and psychological imperative to essentially keep moving forward toward a more fuller capacity. In artistic terms, this correlates directly into a refusal to stay within the confines of your own creative practice, whether that be simply because they're habitual or productive, or they've maybe generated some sort of recognition, but evolving beyond your creative comfort zone, not for exterior recognition or motivation, but out of the integrity of the work, isn't optional if you want to grow and continue to make work that matters. To go back to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, that perception is not a detached or disembodied act. We don't observe the world from some neutral third place. We inhabit it with our full psychological and sensory specificity that's within all of us. The objective then is not self-erasure. It's rather just a more accurate self-positioning between who you are as a person and the work that you're creating. You don't remove yourself from the work, but rather you learn to position yourself correctly within it. Which brings me to my last point, which is about the mark that you leave behind. Marks are the maker. What I've learned over the many years of doing this now is that each photograph carries an unmistakable mark of the person that took that photograph. Whether that person is willing to acknowledge that or not is up to them. We can sit here and, maintain the fiction of neutrality. But I think that the actual reality is simultaneously more interesting and far less flattering. And that's because I think it's very cool that your values permeate through the frame. I want to know how your hesitations affect your compositions, how your courage or the insufficiency of it determines how close you allow yourself to stand to the subject in the frame. To repeat myself, the operative question here has never been whether or not you're present in your work. You are, without exception, always present. The question is just always going to be whether you are present within it consciously or unconsciously. I think that knowing yourself doesn't diminish the work of your art at all. I've personally seen it sharpen my own. And again, these are things that are not going to be easily seen right when you start. These are ideas that spread throughout hopefully the entirety of your life across every single project. And understanding yourself without worshiping yourself strengthens it in ways that become more apparent over time. And the camera may not necessarily be a direct mirror, but it's a reflection of who you are, which means that the mark that you leave behind is not a recognizable preset or a compositional signature trick or a stylistic affectation that you just impose on every single situation. It's the consistent cumulative imprint that you leave on the world. I don't believe that your creative identity is something that you declare, but more so something that you leave behind. It's in the integrity with which you treated your subjects, in your honesty in which you handled complexity, and in the measurable ways that your work evolved as you did. So I guess ultimately what I'm saying here is that if you want better photographs, be more honest. If you want deeper work, become more self-aware. If you want a voice that outlasts the current moment that we're in, stop trying to center yourself and start doing the harder, more rewarding work of understanding you. The rest, the style, the coherence, the recognition, all of that will find its own way. All right, guys, that's going to be it for today's video. I know that this one was a lot of psychology and a lot of philosophy that was thrown at you. There was a lot of big buzzwords, I understand. But this is just how my brain works, and I do really enjoy philosophy, and I do really enjoy psychology, and really examining the more deep portions of this medium. I hope that I was able to kind of say these things in a way that was easy to understand. I'm willing to clarify anything that you need, but I hope that this was educational and informational and that you were able to get something from this. And I hope that you take these lessons and put them into your own work and start that examination process, because it's a long process, but it does make the work so much better and it makes it more rewarding. So you can find me on Instagram at Jared Tapey. You can find me on YouTube, of course, on Substack at Jared Thomas Tapey, or at the Creative Connection, where you'll find a coordinating Substack article to go with this. Oh, yes, shout out to my amazing girlfriend. Her @ on Instagram is at Sophie Bernard for this tie. She's going to have a lot of really cool things coming out soon. If you have seen my Knicks, the New York Knicks coverage photos, me out in the crowds, you have seen my New York Knicks tie that she made me. So be on the lookout at Sophie Bernard. It's at Sophie Bernard, right? On Instagram? At Sophie Bernard _. This is her new business that she is starting, and she's incredibly talented. I wear this tie all the time. So please show her some love as well if you're looking for, something similar to this in the future. Yeah, nothing else to say, but get out there, get shooting, and keep moving forward. I'll catch you on the next one.